It was a mind control program. Their main objective was to create what they called hypno-programmed assassins.
Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience?
The United States Army now admits that it sprayed a chemical that contained cadmium, a known carcinogen, on a neighborhood of more than 10,000 people.
Our history is filled with experiments that many official authorities and governments wanted to keep buried. So today, let's have a look at 4 secret experiments that shocked the world once they got uncovered. Starting with a case that basically proved that ordinary people can be pushed to do some pretty disturbing things, just because someone in authority told them to do it. The Milgram obedience experiments. We're starting off with something that honestly sounds like it shouldn't have been even real in the first place. And I actually remember this case as one of the first we spoke about when I was getting my psychology degree. It all really goes back to the 1960s at Yale, with psychologist Stanley Milgram, who wanted to answer a very uncomfortable question. And that was, how far would people actually go if they were told to harm someone, but it was framed as just following instructions?
Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
And see, the setup was pretty simple, or at least it looked simple. The participants were told they were taking part in a study about memory and learning.
The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
And so they would come into a lab, meet another participant who was actually an actor, and they would be then assigned roles. One person, the real participant, would be the teacher, and the other one, the actor, would be the learner.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher.
And that's where it all began. The learner got strapped into a chair in another room, and they were hooked up to these electrodes, whereas the teacher sat in front of this machine with a bunch of switches that had all sorts of labels, with increasing voltage levels, like mild shock, moderate shock, severe shock, all the way up to something that literally said danger.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor, and the so-called shocks harmless.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock.
And after this, the teacher would begin asking the learner questions, and it is really here where they all start to get a little bit uncomfortable. Because every time the learner answered a question wrong, the teacher had to deliver a shock. And with every wrong answer, the voltage had to go up.
Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
Now, at first it didn't really seem to be that bad, because after the first shock, the learner made a few noises, nothing too dramatic.
Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer horse.
But then it started to escalate pretty quickly. He began complaining about how uncomfortable he was getting. He then began shouting, and then straight up screaming.
This will be at 3:30.
Of course, this was all a simulation, nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
But this wasn't the worst. At one point, the learner actually said that he had heart problems, and so he was begging to be let out. And eventually, he went completely silent.
150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay.
And you would think that at that point, people would just stop, right? Well, not really. Because every time the participant hesitated, the person running the experiment, this calm authority figure in a lab coat, would just say things like, please continue, or the experiment requires you to go on.
He kind of did some yelling in there.
Continue, please. The experiment requires that you go on, teacher.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue.
And here's the part that made this experiment really infamous. See, a lot of people just kept going, like a lot. It was actually around 65% of all the participants that went all the way to the highest voltage levels. Like, they genuinely believed they might be seriously hurting someone, but they still kept pressing the button because the guy in the white coat told them to do so.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me
Dance.
out of here. My heart bothers me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it.
But if you think that these teachers were actually cruel or sadists, well, you'll be wrong, because they were just normal individuals, with regular jobs, like real teachers, office workers, everyday people. And that's exactly what makes this so unsettling, because it really shows how quickly people can shift responsibility. And the thing is, a lot of participants later said one same thing. They didn't feel like it was really their decision to make. They really saw that the authority figure was the one in charge, so they were just doing what they were told to.
2/3 of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat. Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Now, we have, of course, seen this type of behavior before, and we continue to do so even now. And that is really the scary part, because it seems like there are very few people that really have the guts to say no when they're ever in a comparable situation, especially if there are consequences in doing so. Now, what's even more interesting is that before this experiment, Milgram asked other people to predict what would happen. And almost everyone said that barely anyone would go all the way, like maybe 1% at the most. But they were completely wrong.
Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
And that's what makes this so uncomfortable to watch back, because most people still think that they would never do that. And maybe you wouldn't, but the experiment suggests that under the right conditions, you just might. Now, of course, this didn't come without backlash, because participants were put under serious stress. And some were, sweating, shaking, even laughing nervously because they didn't really know how to process what was really happening around them. But the worst part is that they thought it was real.
75 volts, Jim.
Oh.
You don't know.
Yeah. Please continue.
And it's a woman. 105 volts. I don't know.
This kind of experiment would never be really allowed today. And honestly, it's one of the reasons why modern psychology has such strict ethical rules now. But even with all that, this study really gets talked about constantly. Because it doesn't just apply to the lab, it applies to real life as well. And it really helps us understand how people can be doing harmful things in workplaces, in institutions, and even in much larger historical situations, just because they were told to. And it's not really necessarily because they're evil, but because they didn't really question it. And honestly, that's probably the most unsettling part of it all. But now let's talk about a secret program run by a government agency that likely inspired the very famous TV series Stranger Things. Project MKUltra. These secret experiments began in the early 1950s during the Cold War, when the CIA became increasingly concerned about one thing: mind control. See, there was this growing fear that other countries, particularly the Soviet Union, might be developing ways to manipulate human behavior. And these were things like brainwashing, forced confessions, psychological control.
At the end of the Korean War, a number of freed American POWs came home seemingly brainwashed and espousing communist propaganda. American officials suspected that the soldiers had been subjected to what they thought were new communist mind control techniques. Alarmed by the situation, the newly formed CIA allocated $25 million for psychiatric experiments on human beings.
And the question was really simple. Could the same thing be done, but intentionally? So in 1953, MKUltra was officially launched. And what followed was a series of experiments that had over 100 sub-projects, and they all focused on understanding how to influence, control, or alter the human mind.
MKUltra was a government program run by the Central Intelligence Agency. Originally started as something called Bluebird in 1948-49, morphed into Artichoke, and then in 1952 became MKUltra. It was a mind control program, a brainwashing program.
Now to some, this might sound like standard intelligence research, but the way it was carried out, well, that is really what it made it so controversial. Because many of these experiments involved real people who had actually no idea what they were being part of. One of the most well-known aspects of MKUltra was the use of substances like LSD. Now, at the time, LSD was still relatively new, and researchers believed it might be the key tool for breaking down psychological defenses and even manipulating perception. And so the CIA didn't really waste any time, and they began funding experiments where individuals were given this and other substances to observe how it affected their behavior.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible.
But the thing is, many people never knew what they were being given, and they never really consented to it either. The experiments were run on prisoners, patients in hospitals, and even ordinary civilians.
Another common practice was the hosting and observing of LSD-induced parties with live music. These parties were called acid tests, and the culture that grew out of them played a key role in the development of the hippie and psychedelic movements a few years later.
There were certain operations where people were dosed in controlled environments, for example, like the hospital, but in others, it happened in more unusual settings, including situations designed to observe reactions in everyday environments. And we actually even have an infamous example of this, the Operation Midnight Climax.
They established what were called safe houses, where prostitutes would lure men to these apartments. And then once the men were in the apartments, they were dosed with LSD. And then they were basically studied by CIA scientists, usually behind a two-way mirror.
But alongside the use of substances, MKUltra also explored other methods. Things like sensory deprivation, hypnosis, sleep manipulation, and also psychological stress techniques.
Some of the most damaging experiments occurred at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. There, under the direction of infamous Scottish-American psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, unsuspecting patients, many of whom had common ailments such as postpartum depression, were experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails and extreme techniques.
So the idea that Ewan Cameron had come up with before the CIA is involved, if you could bring a person back down to a blank slate, remove all the environmental inputs that have been put into them, and then you can build them back up in your image into whatever you want them to be. So his idea to bring someone down to the blank slate was to induce enough stress that they forgot who they formerly were. And so you reduce them to the blank slate, and then the CIA is really interested in, if you could do that, then you could form them into whatever.
My father was a victim of Dr. Cameron. He was a 27-year-old, healthy skier, canoeer, very athletic, and he had asthma. They told him if he went to the Allen Memorial, they could cure his asthma.
My father, Charles, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. He had a trigeminal neuralgia, it's called, where there's a pain in the temple that radiates into the jaw that apparently is excruciatingly painful. They told him that it was psychosomatic, which it's not, but in those days, what did they know? So they sent him to a shrink. This shrink that he went to was working with Cameron, although we didn't know. So he put my father right into the program.
You know, the goal was really to see how far the human mind could be pushed and whether it could be controlled under specific conditions. And these conditions, you know, were things like sensory deprivation tanks, or rooms with minimal light and sound to really induce the sense of being totally isolated. People would then start to hallucinate. They would develop severe anxiety and cognitive disorientation. But all of this was really there to see if the researchers could break down the mind and make it more suggestible.
I was drugged up so bad, I can't remember half of what they did to me.
He remembered my mother, but he didn't remember he had children or that he had a business or anything. And he was very detached. That never changed. He never came back to the person he was before.
Patients came to the Allen Memorial Institute from all across Canada. Dr. Ewan Cameron, it was said, would give them the best psychiatric care money could buy. But some of the patients had no idea that a lot of their treatment, the LSD, the massive doses of electric shock, the sleep therapy, was highly experimental.
When I was in the hospital in '59, my husband, that's when he told me he thought they were killing me, because he said it was every day and there's a special treatment which he doesn't know. I think there was some sleep. I was always asleep. He used to call the hospital. I couldn't have any visitors for 3 weeks, you see.
A favorite tool was actually a hypnosis, because that has always been the most talked about way of controlling someone's mind.
Their main objective was to create what they called hypno-programmed assassins, people who would kill on command.
And you can see it even being used in entertainment today, where you have people like Darren Brown, you know, putting all these shows in front of an audience. They then pick someone and try to make them do or say things via hypnosis. And then people usually wake up and they don't remember a thing.
And then I couldn't remember where I was supposed to be getting off at.
And see, this is precisely where CIA saw the opportunity. Because what if they could hypnotize their spies? They would then do their bidding, but they would never really remember what they had done, and that would be extremely convenient, because none of these secrets would ever get out.
The objective was to get people to go and commit an act of murder against their moral code and have no memory of their programming. They were also trying to create couriers, people, you know, military people that they could implant messages, send them, you know, across dangerous areas where there were, at that time it was the Vietnam War, and deliver messages and then have them wiped from their memory in case they were captured.
But here is where things get even more concerning, because a lot of the documentation around MKUltra was actually deliberately destroyed. See, in 1973, there were a lot of talks about potential secret intelligence activities. And so as a precaution, the CIA ordered many of the program files to be completely destroyed.
The CIA admitted that they had done this, but no one would say exactly what they did. All the records had been destroyed when the two people who ran it, Richard Helms, who had become the director of the CIA in the 60s, and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was kind of the mad scientist.
And that means that even today, you know, the full scope of what actually happened isn't really completely known. And I mean, that's really scary considering what we do know. And speaking of, it was actually the investigations in the 70s, including the church committee meetings, where the public began to get snippets of what the project had actually included, and that the fact it was actually real.
All came out in Senate and congressional hearings in the 70s. It was exposed, but nobody knew about it until 1974, when Seymour Hersh, the New York Times reporter, reported it on the front page of the paper.
And of course, there were also individual cases that brought more attention to the program as well. And one of the most talked about is a man named Frank Olson, who was a scientist who was unknowingly given LSD as part of the experiment, but he later died after falling from a hotel window in 1953. Now, his death actually remains a subject of debate, but the circumstances, well, they do raise significant questions.
He had knowledge about experiments on human subjects. He had knowledge about, extreme interrogation methods leading to death of the subjects.
But to be clear, not every experiment under the MKUltra was the same. and not all of them involved the same level of risk. But the consistent issue across the program we have is the lack of consent. People not really knowing what they were being part of and what could potentially happen to them. Eventually, MKUltra was officially halted in the 70s, but it still remains as one of the most well-known examples of secret government experimentation. But the scariest thing? Well, I think it's the fact that we'll probably never know how far it actually ever went. But now let's move on to a case that studied hundreds of infected men without ever giving them the proper medicine. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
They were told they'd get treated for their bad blood. Instead, hundreds of poor black men became participants unknowingly in a shocking and truly shameful chapter of American medical history.
Just a warning, this case can be difficult to listen to because it wasn't hidden in some secret underground lab. This was happening out in the open over decades, and the people involved had absolutely no idea what was really being done to them. This is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and it all began in 1932, run by US Public Health Service in Alabama. And the goal, at least officially, was to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis.
According to the Oxford Journal, syphilis was a cultural embarrassment and had many different names that exemplified prejudices of different nationalities. The German and English called it the French pox. The Russians referred to it as the Polish sickness and the Poles as the German sickness. The Japanese called it the Chinese ulcer. In the 16th century, Europe experienced a syphilis epidemic, which was likely caused by the abundance of sailors traveling from seaport to seaport and doing what sailors do when they come into port. In fact, there is some evidence that points to Columbus and his crew being the ones who brought syphilis back from the New World.
And that already should raise some pretty red flags, because by the time this study was actually underway, syphilis was already a known disease. But instead of treating it, researchers decided they wanted to observe what would happen if they left it completely untreated.
Syphilis was considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race.
So they went into the field and they recruited about 600 black men, which most of whom were poor sharecroppers. And about 400 of them had syphilis already, and the rest were used as a control group. And right here is the first major problem. The men were never properly told what the study was actually about. Instead, they were just told that they were being treated for bad blood, which is a really vague term used at the time for a range of illnesses.
He said, well, there was a nurse that came around and she was taking blood from men. They told all of the men that they had bad blood, that they would be treated for their bad blood.
Now, for the compensation of their time, they were actually offered free medical exams, meals, and even burial insurance. So to them, this actually looked like real help.
That narrative is the men were sharecroppers. They were poor, they were uneducated, and they didn't care much about their health. And that's not true. They were survivors.
You know, many of them were actually struggling to make ends meet. And so to them, they really had no choice than to accept. But of course, this offer was too good to be true, because in reality, they weren't being treated for syphilis at all. They were just being observed.
Medical doctors deliberately let them die, wanted them to die.
And I hear what you might be first thinking. You know, maybe this was just a different time. Maybe the proper treatment wasn't just available yet. But this is where it gets worse. By the 1940s, penicillin had actually become the standard and highly effective treatment for syphilis. It was widely available too, and it could have cured the disease if the men were given the meds. And the researchers also knew that.
Canadian output of this amazing drug, perhaps the medical discovery of the war, has been greatly increased. Penicillin, the great germ killer.
But instead, they made sure that the participants never received this, even going as far as preventing them from getting it elsewhere. And let's not forget that this went on for decades, because the study itself actually continued on for 40 years.
Everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, this is wrong, is culpable.
And as you can imagine, during that time, many of the men began suffering from severe health complications from untreated syphilis. There were, of course, loads that died as well. And then there were those who unknowingly passed it on to their wives and subsequently their children as well.
What we don't know is how many of their wives they infected, how many of their children caught it in the womb, how many of them died, how many people got terribly, terribly ill.
The men were angry at first, in disbelief. There was trauma and there was shame.
Many patients experienced damage to their vital organs and nervous systems, and for some, the lack of treatment led to death.
But even in doing so, all the participants actually still believed that they were receiving proper medical care. And this is really what makes this case so disturbing. Because this wasn't just neglect. All of this was deliberate.
I could not believe that an agency of the federal government, as much as of a mistake as it was initially, could let this continue for 40 years. It just made me furious. None of the morality was ever questioned. I still have not heard the answer to the very simple question of why. They should have been able to determine after the first 3 or 4 autopsies that the inside of a black person ravaged by syphilis looks identical to the insides of a white person and stop the study.
Eventually, in the early 1970s, the truth started to come out. A whistleblower leaked information about the study to the press, and in 1972, the whole thing was exposed publicly.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23. The person he reported to said, "This really isn't part of your job. Don't worry about it. It's none of your business."
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings.
This, of course, sparked national outrage, and so finally the study was shut down, and several investigations were launched.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
In 1973, so just a year later, this massive lawsuit was filed on behalf of the participants and their families, which did lead to settlement and some financial compensation. But of course, that never really could have undone what had already happened.
Survivors, victims of the study, and their families did win a $10 million settlement from the US government, and the study's disclosure led to modern medical ethics procedures.
And it wasn't actually until 1997 that a formal apology was issued by Bill Clinton on behalf of the US government.
We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
Now, this case had a massive impact on medical ethics in the United States, because after this, new regulations were put in place. You know, things like informed consent, oversight boards, and stricter protections for human subjects in research. But these are basically all rules that really should have been there from the very start.
One of the important aspects of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was the role it played in transforming regulations in the United States regarding research on human subjects.
However, even with those changes, the legacy of this experiment didn't really just disappear. It heavily contributed to a deep and lasting distrust in the healthcare system among Black communities especially, and that is something that still has real consequences to this day.
This long history of medical experimentation on African Americans creates a sense of distrust, a distrust of doctors and physicians, a distrust of medical care.
Some people believe that the men were injected with syphilis.
We can't forget what happened to Tuskegee, and in one way, COVID helped keep the lessons of Tuskegee alive.
And honestly, that's what makes this case hit so hard. Because it wasn't just some bizarre one-off experiment that sounds too strange to be true. It was systematic, prolonged, and it was carried out by institutions that people were supposed to trust.
I asked my father, how did he feel about being in that study? And my father looked at me very calmly and in control and said, baby, I cannot do anything about what has happened to me and all of those other men who were in the study. But it's up to you all to make sure that nothing like this happens again.
But now let's have a look at something that could belong to a dystopian movie, with thousands passing away in agonizing conditions without ever understanding why. Secret civilian radiation experiments. So this all takes place mainly during the 1940s and 1950s, right in the middle of the early Cold War. At that point in time, nuclear technology was developing fast, and governments, especially in the United States, were trying to understand one thing above all else. What does radiation actually do to the human body?
But the Department of Defense was very interested in the effects of total body irradiation. Because if there's a nuclear war and people get irradiated, are they going to be able to function? Will a pilot who's flying a plane be able to land the plane? Will they be able to work?
But the thing is, instead of relying only on lab studies or willing participants, some researchers took it much further.
Most of the patients who were irradiated were poor. Most of the patients who were irradiated were African American. All of them had cancer. Out of the 90 people who were irradiated, 21 of them were dead within a month.
But actually it gets worse, because some of these experiments were actually funded by agencies like the US Atomic Energy Commission.
In 1947, an American tribunal laid out the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical guidelines for conducting scientific research on human subjects. Among the code's 10 core principles are that voluntary, informed consent must always be obtained from the subjects, and that the experiment should yield results which are useful to society and unobtainable by other means, and that the degree of risk to the subject should never exceed the humanitarian benefit expected from the results of the treatment. But the demands of war so often override such high-minded principles, and as the Second World War gave way to the Cold War, the United States began conducting its own series of highly unethical human experiments.
And there are several documented cases where hospital patients were injected with radioactive substances like plutonium without their knowledge or consent.
Discovered in February 1941 by chemist Glenn Seaborg at UC Berkeley, plutonium does not occur in nature and is produced by bombarding U-238 with neutrons. Not only was plutonium potentially toxic, but as an alpha particle emitter, even a small quantity absorbed into the body could expose workers to dangerous amounts of radiation and long-term health risks like cancer.
But these people weren't the ones who actually signed up for risky trials. Many were already vulnerable, like patients who were sick, they were hospitalized, or in situations where they trusted doctors to help them.
Ironically, the people they wanted to do this experiment on were precisely the people who were least likely to derive any benefit from it. We knew that certain kinds of cancer were sensitive to radiation. The Department of Defense wasn't particularly interested in the effects of radiation on people with metastatic cancer. They wanted to know what the effects of radiation were on a healthy 23-year-old pilot. And that could be best studied by irradiating people whose cancers were not going to respond.
But they were never told what was actually happening to them. They were never told they were being exposed to radiation. And they sure as hell were never told about the potential risks. Now, at the time, researchers were trying to measure how radioactive materials move through the body. For example, how long they stay there, what organs they affected, things like that. But none of the subjects ever consented to it. And this wasn't just one isolated incident either. There were multiple experiments across different locations. In some cases, pregnant women and children were also exposed to radioactive substances, sometimes through food or medical procedures, again without ever being fully informed.
This was an experiment on 800 women who were in various stages of pregnancy. They were at a clinic for their prenatal checkups, and they were given radioactive iron cocktails. And then they were basically forgotten. And that there was a follow-up study done by a scientist who found statistically significant number of cancers in the children.
There was, of course, the infamous case about children at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts who were being given radioactive porridge. But get this was actually a collaboration between researchers from the MIT and Harvard and Quaker Oats themselves.
Fernald School is the oldest institution of its kind in the country. At its peak, some 2,500 people were confined here at a time, most of them children, all of them called feeble-minded, whether they were or not.
And why? Well, they just wanted to see how nutrients were being absorbed, and the kids were told they were joining a science club.
These were young boys at a school, at an orphanage, and they were selected for these oatmeal studies in which radioactive calcium was placed in their oatmeal. And in exchange for that, they were given trinkets and taken to ball games and Mickey Mouse watches. And here they were at a group home, treated like throwaways. And they were bribed with these trinkets for their cooperation. You know, they had to provide various specimens and blood tests and so on and so forth.
But let's add another layer to this. Because they weren't just direct injections or radioactive oatmeal. There were also tests involving environmental exposure. For example, radioactive materials were sometimes released to study how they would spread through the air and affect populations.
Secret government experiment that was carried out in St. Louis.
The fog drifted through the streets like a ghost.
That's exactly what it looked like, a thick fog.
It was summertime and it was hot. We would just run through it as fast as we could and try to just cool ourselves off. It stuck to you.
The spray was so foul as far as the odor. It made some of us have headaches, nausea, dizziness.
That's what I remember. It made me sick.
The United States Army now admits that it sprayed a chemical that contained cadmium, a known carcinogen, on a neighborhood of more than 10,000 people. Critics say this was done with no warning and no consent. Although the Army admits that the test happened, it is not admitted to harming the residents.
There was, of course, the Hanford site in 1949, where iodine-131 was released to test how well the US system could detect Soviet nuclear activity. The effects actually spread into parts of Washington and Oregon, with locals never being informed. And you might have actually heard of this being referred to as the Green Run, because the substance wasn't cooled, and so it was actually freshly radiated.
The Atomic Energy Commission did not warn the public about possible exposure to iodine-131 or other radioactive gases, or about radionuclides in the Columbia River. Afterwards, many people reported mysterious health complications. But because the Department of Energy did not reveal the facts about Hanford's radiation releases until 1986, it was decades after the war before many people were accurately diagnosed.
The problem was that the late fall in the Columbia Basin is always full of fog and inversions. And the Department of Defense officials were here for 2 or 3 weeks, and they finally got what they thought was going to be an okay day. They did release the gas, and an inversion moved in, and it actually rained. The gas came down close in and heavy.
There was also the Nevada test site in the 50s and 60s, or the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the idea was to really simulate what might happen during a nuclear event. But of course, the people living in those areas were never told, and in the following years, there turned out to be a lot of issues reported across the affected areas, especially higher cancer rates in people.
They had fatigue, they developed skin cancers, strange rashes on their body, blisters. They were in great pain. They vomited constantly, and their bone marrow disappeared. They basically had the advanced stages of radiation sickness, much like the victims of Hiroshima or Nagasaki had. They developed toxic shock syndrome, and they died. They went into comas and died.
Now, to be clear, not every experiment had the same level of risk. And in some cases, researchers believe the exposure levels were very low, like, for example, in the oatmeal study, where allegedly they didn't really find any short-term health effects. But that doesn't really change the fact that people weren't really told what was happening to them. And that's really the core issue here, because at the time, much of this was kept a secret. The public didn't know. And even many of the participants didn't even know what had been done to them until decades later. And it wasn't really until the 1990s that a lot of this information started to come out publicly. Investigations were launched, documents were declassified, and the US government acknowledged that these experiments had taken place.
New revelations show the UK government was linked to secret Cold War radiation experiments on cancer patients and civilians, which has been kept hidden from the public for over 50 years.
We had established the Nuremberg Code, which had been accepted into medical ethics worldwide. And then after all that, America was conducting these experiments. Now, that kind of came out as a huge scandal in the 90s in America, that they had done this to civilians, and people got paid off and it went quiet. No one ever thought anybody else was involved. Well, I found a series of documents hidden behind national security at the Atomic Weapons Establishment, which is part of the MOD that deals with our nuclear weapons, in which they had this committee meeting in Whitehall with British military who were receiving the results of these deeply unethical and horrific experiments, and basically requesting more information. There was senior RAF, Royal Navy and Army personnel present, British medics and scientists. That in itself is just kind of horrific, that Britain knew about this, said nothing, when the scandal broke, said nothing, and also seems to have directed or had a hand in, somehow influenced perhaps further experiments.
Then in 1995, President Bill Clinton established an advisory committee to investigate human radiation experiments, which led to a detailed report outlining what had really happened. And the findings did confirm that in multiple cases, ethical standards had not been followed.
The United States of America offers a sincere apology to those of our citizens who were subjected to these experiments.
And just like with the other cases from this area, this had a lasting impact because it contributed to public distrust, and not just in governments, but in medical and scientific institutions as well. But on the other hand, it also helped push major changes in how research is conducted today. Things like informed consent, transparency, and independent review boards became much stricter, and largely because of cases like this. But of course, even with those changes, the reality is still very uncomfortable. Because this wasn't some fringe operation or a single rogue scientist. This involved official programs, real funding, and institutions that people trusted. And for the people affected, well, most of them never really knew what they're really being part of. Until next time.